Hi, so my name is Zoë Robaey. I'm an assistant professor in ethics of technology at Wageningen University. My expertise comes from my experience with responsible innovation processes in biotechnology. And in these responsible innovation processes, there are different dimensions that we engage in. And one of these dimensions is called inclusion or inclusiveness. So joining this project was an opportunity to dive into the topic of inclusion. So when we started this project, we had a few ideas from what came from our partners, but we didn't start with an assumption of the definition of inclusion. And looking at literature in different fields, you see different definitions. And in responsible innovation, inclusion has to do a lot with participation. So including voices in technological development, in technological choices of different groups of society. In practice, we also see a lot of people who do inclusion. Basically, you see different ways of understanding it in practice and in theory. So when we went into this project, we wanted to capture that diversity and look at really what would unite all these different ways of doing inclusion or understanding inclusion. And one of the things we find is that on the one hand, inclusion can represent something that is procedural, so like participation of stakeholders. And on the other hand, it's something that's also substantial, so that looks at achieving certain societal goals, like economic justice, sustainability, autonomy. And so that's what we came to find in this project. Into technological development, you see how knowledge isn't necessarily shared on the same level by everyone. So someone might come up with a great idea to do something, and someone else might come up with a great plan of how to implement this idea. But the people that will be impacted by these technological developments, they don't necessarily they don't take part in those decisions. And what you then risk encountering is that you innovate in a vacuum. So inclusion is very important to not innovate in a vacuum. So to innovate with people and for people. So I think that's the main reason why I think it's important. And then you could ask, yeah, but why is this important? And it has to do with the goals of inclusion. So sustainability. If you want a project to be economically, socially, and environmentally sustainable, you can't do it just with an idea. You need to understand the context to get people on board and to create a situation that will help that project move forward. And that's what I mean with that it doesn't happen in a vacuum. So you need to take into account the context in order to achieve certain goals. The first obstacle to bio-based value chain is that often you have the biomass that grows far from the place where it has to be used. So this global aspect is a challenge, because with those new value chains, you transform the biomass into other products like energy, and that energy is used elsewhere. So there's a big distance between the place where the raw materials are produced and where the outputs are used. And that makes it difficult to do inclusion, because if you're far, you don't necessarily understand the challenges, the context of the place where this is happening. Another challenge is that with bio-based value chains, you're dealing with the raw material that is alive. That means it degrades with time. It's not always of the same quality and consistency because it depends on the climate. And that's something that will impact your logistics, but that will also impact the way you want to work with local stakeholders to make it in a way that works for them and not that adds to their burden. And I think another challenge is that since they're very new, you need commitment. You need commitment along the value chain. And one thing that we find is that depending where you are in the value chain, your context will be different, maybe because you're in another country, maybe because you're in another industry. And your outlook will have a different timeline, a different future. So if you're a farmer participating in a value chain, you work from this season to the next. If you are investing in a biorefinery, it's a big infrastructure that will take you, thinking for at least 20 years. And if you work in the markets of, let's say, energy with biofuels, then you might think for maximum 5 years ahead. So this is another challenge that we see is how do you create commitment with a value chain that's complex, that's global, and where everyone has their own constraints from their own realities. Absolutely. And I think that was also in the challenge I was just mentioning, the local reality of farmers needs to be taken into account in how you set up the logistics of a chain. So if you think, for instance, we were in Iowa and they were harvesting stover, which is the leftover from the corn, to make second generation biofuels, bioethanol. When we were there, we were supposed to arrive after farming season, so at the end. But that year they had an exceptionally wet year. So their harvesting season moved from 8 weeks to 5 weeks. And when we were there, we met farmers who had literally been working 21 hours a day to make it on time with harvesting not only the biomass, because it's a process, right? You harvest your corn and then you have the leftovers left on the field that you harvest then 2 days later when they have dried out a little bit. So if it rains, it also challenges this. And it's an immense enterprise. So you need to think, if you say, well, I want so many tons of biomass so I can make so much energy, you have to know that the biomass comes from somewhere where people might run into harvesting challenges, which might be linked to climate, but which might also sometimes be linked to equipment. I think another example of that tension is linked to the difference in how do I say that? The difference in context is so large. So, many developing countries will have a lot of biomass because they happen to be in the area of the tropics where things grow a lot. And one of our cases was in Jamaica, where there was no project that we investigated, but we investigated how such a project would come in that context. What would it mean for whom? How would it happen? And there the challenge was that, you have to deal with institutional challenges, like who is a farmer and who is a cane cutter And how do you get everybody on board to participate in those new value chains? So where do you start? Which community leader should you approach? And how do you present the added value for them? And other things that are contextual and political is, for instance, in Jamaica, they have something called a sugar pricing formula. So farmers get money based on the sugar content of their cane. So how would you institutionally arrange the payment for leftover from sugarcane industry to be transformed to energy? And this needs to be discussed with farmers association, and you enter the local politics and the reality of how can I create this project and create ways to sharing benefits that will be sustainable. There's different ways to start a value chain in the bioeconomy. So you can start it from a product, like we need this product and we would like to have it bio-based to, you know, move away from chemical production. Then if you start from there, then you can think about what do you need and where does it come from? And then question before you would go, would it work? Like, would it add something to the farmers' lives? How can this project contribute to, you know, the goals of inclusion I was mentioning before? So economic justice, sustainability, and economical and in environmental and social ways. And then you can go back to your, you know, value proposition and think, okay, how do I make this work? And then take the necessary steps to make your project as good as you can. Then there's another way to think about it, and you could say, well, there are farmers who are losing income because they're working with certain crops that are not going to be used anymore. And that's, for instance, one of the cases in our project, Sunchem, that worked with non-GMO modified tobacco. So then you start with the crop and you say, what's for the future of tobacco farmers? How can we create opportunities? And then starting from their expertise and what they know, you can start building new value chains and deciding which way is the best way to go. So yeah, I think that's my recommendation. Try to figure out whether you're starting from the product or whether you're starting from the crop, and then to look at what are the different things you can do to be more inclusive. And there are many things you can do.